Hello, welcome back to Behind the Faders, the live sound channel. Today I want to talk about miking an orchestra. There's more than one way of miking an orchestra, and it depends on how many microphones you have at your disposal and how many channels on your desk you have at your disposal. There are different approaches, especially when it comes to violins and violas. I mean, there's not a lot of secrets to miking a trumpet or a timpani. And like I said, there's more than one way. So I can only tell you about my way of doing it. So I'll take you through all the instruments with the most important two mics at the end of it. So violins and violas. Some engineers like to mic each and every single one of them, which of course ends up in the tonal mics. It doesn't really make sense to me. I always try to use as few mics as possible. And by the way, even if you don't mic every single violin and viola, you will still end up with a lot of mics. So it's helpful if you have these little combination boxes that allow you to plug two microphones into one channel. So what type of mic? You will usually use a small diaphragm condenser like this one. Some engineers like to use clip mics. I don't really like the sound of clip mics in classical music because they never really capture the entire instrument, and they don't sound very natural. However, having said that, I did a lot of crossover concerts and tours with an orchestra and a rock band. In that context, you need to use clip mics because otherwise these violins will never be able to keep up with these very direct signals of a rock band. You might have seen videos with the rock band and orchestra, and as soon as the band comes in, the orchestra is pretty much gone most of the time. And I had this experience, actually the very first crossover concert that I've ever done turned out to be the biggest that I've ever done, which was the Scorpions with the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra back in 1999 at the Brandenburg Gate. At that time I didn't have much experience, and also I wasn't able to interfere with the miking or anything. I mean, it was a huge event. And I didn't even mix the orchestra because back then, in the analog days, you had a limited channel count on your desk. So there was a guy in a container pre-mixing the orchestra for me and sending me some subgroups. But that was the first time I noticed how an orchestra disappears when the band comes in. And there's a YouTube video about them playing Wind of Change on that occasion, and I put a link down in the description box. Although if you listen to this, I'm not sure if that was my sound in this video or the broadcast sound, so I can't remember, but you can kind of hear how the orchestra disappears even though it's not a very busy song. So much about clip mics. So like I said, I don't mic each and every instrument. I like to mic desks. You could mic the concertmaster on his own, and I did that loads of times, but it never really made sense. So I'm just miking desk by desk by desk. So two people at a time. Now, of course, it's kind of obvious. You put a microphone in the center between the two violins, pointing downwards. The problem is, of course, I mean, it kind of works, but you're basically miking the floor with a little bit of violin coming in from left and right. And I learned a different method from a very experienced classical sound engineer, which is this. You move the mic over towards one violin, so that violin comes in louder because it's closer, but you point it at the other one. And that always works really well for me. But you have to remember, if you do that, look at the picture, you have to move the microphone towards the violin where the bow is moving away from the mic. So you stay out of the bow of the other violin, which is moving towards the mic. And that's a very crucial point anyway, because the musicians will just, if it's in their way, they will just grab the mic stand and put it somewhere else. They don't care. So let's move on to Shelley. I mean, again, it depends on how many mics you have and what type of mics. A small diaphragm condenser will still work, but a large diaphragm condenser like this one works better on Shelley. And you can all still mic desk by desk. You don't have to mic every single one. Upright bass, same thing. You can mic, if you have 3 upright basses, you can just put 2 mics in between them. Large diaphragm condenser. What really helps sometimes, I don't know why that is, but very often bassists have pickups because they also play in bands or something. That helps if you have one of these upright basses on a pickup and have a really direct signal. Then, well, if we come to all the brass and woodwinds, I mean, it's kind of obvious where to put them right? With one exception, which is horns. Some engineers say I always mic the horns not at the horn, which is facing to the back, because it's facing to the back for a reason. And the desired sound is how it sounds in front of the instrument, which is a fair point. I did both. If the horns were in a really loud environment, I would then still mic the horn and EQ it in a way that it sounds like the microphone would be standing in front of it. On other occasions, I mic'd it from the front. It's a case-by-case decision you might want to find out by yourself. Timpani, like any drum, all other percussions, vibraphone, all the stuff, I try to cover with 2 overheads, maybe 3. So I'm not micing each and every section of that as well. And now, the 2 most important mics. An orchestra is a complete sound entity all by itself, okay? Can we all agree on that? So where does this orchestra sound best? It sounds best at the position of the conductor, because the conductor is designing that sound. He tells the trumpets to hold back, he tells the cello to play a little bit louder. He makes it sound like he wants at his position. So what I always do is I take 2 large diaphragm condenser mics and I position them left and right of the conductor. And these are my main mics. I try to use these as much as possible before I come to all the other mics. So much for the miking. And today I talk about how to mix the orchestra. Now, just to get this out of the way, you can go really crazy with mixing an orchestra. Not with EQ or dynamics or effects. It's all about either input delays or routing. For example, there is a way of measuring the distance from downstage center to each and every single desk and applies an input delay of that distance to each of your input channels. The theory behind that, probably, I never talked to anyone who really did that. The theory behind it is that if you stand in front of an orchestra, you will hear the last row later than the first row. Because, I mean, an orchestra stage is pretty deep. So let's say if it's 10 meters deep, then you have a delay of 30 milliseconds from the last row. And now that everything is close mic'd, everything comes out of the speakers at the same time. So then to reinstall this experience, they do all these input delays. Does it really work? I don't think so. First of all, yes, 30 milliseconds is audible as a delay, but I mean, an orchestra is not really a funk band. You know, an orchestra is not about precise timing. So I would believe that 30 milliseconds are still well in the range of the human factor. So a musician might easily play 30 milliseconds up front or behind the beat. So, and the other thing is you don't deal with isolated signals. So there's so much spill and some instruments blow into so many different microphones that now all have different input delay that it's likely more to become a bit of a mess, really. I never heard it. I can't really judge it, but I don't think it really works. And another method is like a very clever output routing when it comes to near fills, like a bit like delta stereo. So you have certain instruments coming from certain directions. And over the last years, of course, there's immersive audio that came into the picture, like the Lisa system of L Acoustic, where you have not 2 line arrays, but 6 or 8. And you send different instrument groups to different line arrays. Haven't heard it yet. Can't judge it. It might be the future, but I think the average way of mixing an orchestra is still the good old left and right, and it will be for a good while, I think. So, How do I approach this? First of all, I'm utilizing some subgroups and DCAs in this. My first subgroup will be violins and violas, because I don't want to EQ all those channels separately. But basically what this subgroup has is a low cut, like 160 hertz or so, and that might surprise you, a pretty severe high cut. I learned that as well from a very experienced classical sound engineer. You can high cut violins at like 5.5K. If you have the imagination of the silvery treble shine, it's not there. You'd lose nothing by doing this high cut. Quite the opposite. It helps, of course, with avoiding feedback in high frequencies. And also, sometimes before I did that, I had complaints from the audience that they could hear the turning of the pages. And you'll avoid that by a good amount as well. Try it out. If you don't believe me, just try it. Other than that, you might say, why not give violins and violas separate subgroups? They might need different EQs. Not really. And they sound different, but they don't really need different EQs. Actually, a lot of times I don't use any EQ rather than a low and a high cut. Maybe take out a little bit of the sharpness if it's there. And especially if you're still using clip mics, it will be there. So you need to take out some sharpness. But that's about all of it. Second stereo subgroup will go to the low string, so shelly and bass. Of course, the low cut now is down at like maybe 60 hertz, same high cut. EQ-wise, hardly anything most of the time. Then the third subgroup will be woodwinds. Now, of course, I don't EQ all the woodwinds on a subgroup, but these subgroups are there for another reason as well. I will go through the woodwinds, low cut, high cut on the subgroup, but then I will go through them if needed. I mean, like I told you in the last video, I don't really do a sound check. So I will maybe listen to only the woodwinds with the entire orchestra playing. And if I hear a problem, I will address it. But there's not really a typical area that you always have to kind of deal with. And that's it for subgroups, because these subgroups also have the purpose of feedback hunting. So after this rehearsal, or call it sound check, whatever you will, when everybody's gone, especially when I had a feeling that I'm already on the edge of creating feedbacks, I will now bring these subgroups up in level until I really create a feedback, and then there will be a graphic EQ on all of these subgroups, and I will take out the first 1, 2, 3 frequencies that feedback. And that usually gives me enough headroom, even if I have to bring the volume up a bit during the show. Then, and one instrument I never mentioned before, the harp. That will not go onto any subgroup. I will just, that's one channel, and if it's likely to feedback, I can do some EQing on that single channel. After that comes brass. That isn't going on a subgroup because brass is not likely to feedback. They're all very loud and they're sitting way back on the stage. Of course, there's also a low and a high cut. I prepare that beforehand, of course, not while I'm mixing. Little bit of harshness maybe on the trumpets. Again, there's no rules and there's no typical EQ. Then percussion. Like I said, I will have all the kettle drums one by one. Little low cut, they don't need to go all the way down, and the typical high cut. And the overheads that cover all the rest of it, they will get a low cut. They will get no high cut really, because there's some high frequency information that might be useful when it comes to their chimes and triangle, whatever they play. By the way, no dynamics. I don't use any compression on any of this. Now, DCAs. I use a lot of DCAs, and I think if you're mixing an orchestra, you're not mixing on an X32 or something, you will have a lot of DCAs at your disposal. So on the DCAs, I will have all the separate instrument groups. So first violin, second violin, viola, cello, bass, harp, so on and so on. And in case I have a vocal, some singer, then the last DCA will be the entire orchestra. I might not use most of these DCAs because, I mean, like I said, it's so much spill going on. So subtle movements on a DCA will not get you anywhere, but sometimes it's just helpful to have them there. And of course, there's my main two mics, left and right of the conductor. They don't go to any subgroup, they don't go to any DCA. I handle these on the channels because they might need a little more help with EQing, and because I use these, like I said, I use these as my kind of main mics. And that's already basically it. When it comes to reverb, it depends, but on open air, a little bit overall reverb can be helpful. Of course, you should then use an emulation of a concert hall, so hall reverb. I send mostly violins and woodwinds to it. Brass, maybe a little, no percussion. Percussions are so loud on the stage that they will blow in some mics that have reverb on them anyway. And that's pretty much it. At the end of a day, mixing classical music is fairly simple. If you have a different opinion or question, please leave it in the comment section. If you have a lot of questions, consider booking a coaching call. The email address for that is also in the video description. So that's it for today. Bye-bye.